Hey everyone, I wanted to go over the new and exciting news we got from Monster Hunter Stories 2 on the Nintendo Switch. During all of the E3 turmoil, a lot of people might have actually missed the fact that Famitsu, a magazine in Japan, had a developer's interview with some of the developers for Monster Hunter Stories 2, and they went over a ton of basic information that we might have not been able to see in the past, that I believe at the very least was vaguely touched upon during the Nintendo Treehouse presentation after the Nintendo Direct. But there was still a ton of information during this specific interview with Famitsu that they did not necessarily go over that I want to try to get to as best as possible. And just within the first 2 pages, they spend a little bit of time explaining some of the buddy characters that will be joining your team, but also characters that you'll be able to meet alongside the world as you explore and basically just get to know other villages. Because we do know that you'll be traveling all around the world in this specific game, and you'll be able to meet not just a bunch of people from the very specific village that you start on, but also a bunch of characters from different village that are specifically stuck to that village. So if you want to definitely be able to get to know them a little bit more, you're gonna have to keep hanging around that village to be able to make friends with them. But on the second page is finally when we start to see some interesting stuff, and that's the fact that they show off, at the very least, just some of the story bosses that you'll be able to fight throughout the entire game. We do know this based off of the fact that in the Treehouse presentation, one of the boss fights that they showed off was against an Anjanath with glowing red eyes. They seem to be angered for something, for a very specific reason that wasn't necessarily explained, and even in the Treehouse presentation they don't actually go through explaining as to why that is. It does have to do with those pools of water being like glowing red, but even that's a little bit of a secret as well, where obviously the story is going to be able to explain things a little bit further. So in this specific Famitsu magazine, they show off just a couple of the monsters that you'll be going to be fighting in a very specific boss-like scenario, a boss encounter. We also do know that after you handle one of these boss encounters, you basically get access to their lair. So that's going to be another one of those things that you're going to be not just forced to do for story's sakes, but also be able to do if you want to be able to get eggs of these very specific monsters that you're going to have to basically take down before you get access to being able to hatch eggs from them specifically. We then begin to get a couple of environmental shots of some of the frozen area villages that we're going to be able to explore, and they are basically just showing off this one specifically, but we've seen a couple of the other villages as well. So they are like finally starting to introduce some of those ideas that there's about 6 different villages. They're all tied to different elements, of course, and you're going to be able to explore each one of those villages fully and be able to actually go around the area of each one of those villages and tame monsters from each one of those specific areas as well. We then get a pretty clear look as to what monsters are going to be able to do in the overworld, and how some monsters have very specific traits and benefits if you take those specific monsters to not just one specific area, but also during a very specific weather effects. So for example, Lagiacrus can basically be taken underwater, and you could use it to cross rivers and lakes and stuff like that. So other monsters might not necessarily have that ability. We know that Laggy will be able to do that. Meanwhile, Diablos can basically power through a sandstorm. If there's any sort of sandstorm in the very specific area that you're exploring at the moment, if you get on a Diablos, if you happen to have one, you'll be automatically just not have to deal with any of that whatsoever, and you could just power right on through with it. Whereas like in other monsters that you're riding who don't necessarily have that ability, might have to basically wait for it to go down or really find a different way to go around it. And that's not all necessarily tied to just like weather effects or even specific abilities. Some other monsters will have very similar abilities. We know that jumping is one of them, diving, running faster, powering through as in like rushing through a very specific area. All of those are going to be different monster abilities that they're going to be able to have, but only some of them are going to have that. Not every single monster is going to have all of those abilities until you start messing with the DNA system. And that's actually something that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But before then, they do showcase the dens and essentially how you're going to be able to hatch eggs as you are basically able to explore a den for a very specific monster. They showed off even in the Treehouse presentation that once you go into a den, you take care of a monster after you take it down, you are able to go into his den and basically get a couple of eggs from it. Warp right out of the area and be able to just take that egg right into this specific really cute looking Meowster, this cat, and be able to get it to hatch you a couple of eggs. You do have a limited amount of spaces for the eggs that you can hatch, and it's not like they take very long anyways. In a couple of in-game hours you should be able to hatch quite a few amount of eggs to begin with based on the information that we have already. So it's something that you're just basically going to be doing constantly while you're going out and exploring, gathering materials and coming back to the den to be able to just pick up way more eggs and just keep growing that roster of monsters. And the reason why you want to do that is because every single new monster is going to have basically a DNA set of abilities. And this is something that they show off in the Famitsu Magazine scans, where you are basically just trying to constantly get more and more monsters, because you can eventually start splicing their DNA in this 3x3 grid. And all that does is basically takes an ability from one monster that typically wouldn't be able to have, and you slide it into another monster. So in the Treehouse presentation, they spoke about how like a fire monster can now have a lightning attack, or like a monster that's necessarily slow can now be faster because, you know, they gave them like a speed buff that from another monster that they would typically have. You do lose the monster that's getting like that ability taken away from it. This is why you're constantly gonna want to be hatching eggs to be able to get way more monsters and way more abilities. So if you want to have like a party of like 6 monsters that you're constantly rotating through, you're basically just gonna keep wanting to have like a bunch of like trash monsters that you're just farming for abilities. That's essentially how the meta is gonna work out. So they do showcase a little bit of this in the Famitsu Magazine scans, but for all intents and purposes, we basically have known that this mechanic is basically going to be like the end game farming technique. Like if you want to have the best monsters, the best abilities, this is essentially what's going to like be the driving factor of it. We also know that like armors are not necessarily something that you craft within a very specific piece, like gloves and hats and torsos and legs or any of that. It's just one specific armor set, but you need a couple of parts, and they're not even like, hey, you need a tail or a spear or a ruby or anything like that. It's just like, how many pieces of monsters do you have for this very specific monster? Each one of them has a value, and then you are basically able to craft that armor set. Think of it like scraps. It's in the same system, it's in the same vein. Just if you're trying to like level up your armor, for example, in Monster Hunter Rise, you need a certain amount of pieces. They don't necessarily care what pieces they are. Each one of them has a value, and as long as you hit that value, you'll be able to do it. It's no different than scraps. As long as you have a scrap or any other piece of that monster, you'll be able to trade it in for scraps. It's that very same idea, but it's now tied to that monster armor set that you're going to be able to craft. But yeah, a lot of people probably missed this Famitsu Magazine scans because, again, E3 was happening and a lot of information was actually coming out all at the same time. We do know that Capcom actually held 4 separate different trailers throughout E3 for Monster Hunter Stories 2. And even at the big Nintendo Direct presentation, they had yet another trailer, and they had the big, I believe it was the longest presentation for the Treehouse. I believe it was like 42 minutes long, where they just went into deep dives into this game, and they showed off quite a lot of it, to be completely fair. And it looks extremely interesting, but again, it's one of those things where like they are just basically putting Monster Hunter Rise in the back burner so they could focus entirely on Monster Hunter Stories 2. Whether that's fair or not is entirely, you know, up to a personal opinion. But you know, if anyone from Monster Hunter Rise feels a little bit burned, I definitely understand it. If you're brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up. And as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya.